This greatly aids in the expulsion of the placenta, and the uterus is not in good shape at this point, okay? And it's going to need a lot of TLC to bring it back to any kind of normal muscle tone. And so it really helps to continue these contractions to help restore the muscle tone of the uterus. Okay, and finally the placenta, it's essential that the placenta pass out. In addition, there may or may not be quite a significant number of clots still remaining in the uterus, and those need to be passed as well. Okay, there's the placenta. Okay, so let's talk about lactation now, and which is certainly part of the process. Okay, electron micrograph of a highly magnified little gland that produces the milk, and of course you need to have three substances. You need to have casein, which is the protein. You need to have the lactose, which is the sugar, and of course fat. Okay, and a certain amount of calcium and other ingredients. Okay, so the milk letdown, as long as we're talking about oxytocin, it's important to mention the milk letdown reflex, which is quite analogous to what goes on at birth. And breastfeeding by the newborn, the tactile stimulation of the nipple causes the posterior pituitary to release oxytocin. And remember those little ampullae where the milk is stored at the breast? The oxytocin, they also have oxytocin receptors, and those ampullae contract under the influence of oxytocin, and that's called the milk letdown reflex. I've heard moms say that sometimes even the thought or hearing a baby cry could cause the milk letdown reflex to occur, resulting in the release of a whole bunch of milk at the wrong time. But anyway, the point being, you not only need to produce the milk in the process called lactation, but you need to engage the milk letdown reflex. Another interesting thing about the milk letdown reflex is that if you nurse the newborn, the uterine contractions continue because the uterine muscle cells are still expressing oxytocin receptors. And so the milk letdown reflex releases oxytocin. And this is just another slide that I think I slightly prefer, showing the milk letdown reflex, which is another example of positive feedback. Okay. Breastfeeding induces uterine contractions, which is good for the uterine muscle cells to help restore muscle tone. Okay. Since uterine muscle cells are still expressing oxytocin receptors, they continue to contract, okay, under the influence of breastfeeding. Prolactin is needed to produce milk along with progesterone. Remember, when you think progesterone, you think function, but you also need prolactin, which is produced by the adenohypophysis. We didn't say much about it before, but it's needed in order to produce milk, in order to lactate. Continued high levels of estrogen and progesterone cause the hypophyseal release of prolactin. And never do we have such high levels of estrogen and progesterone as we do at the end of pregnancy. Some believe this to be the cause. Some females experience a little bit of breast pain at the end of every menstrual cycle, and some people think this might be because of prolactin release. Who knows? Astronomical levels of estrogen and progesterone at the end of pregnancy trigger milk secretion by the mammary glands. Prolactin induces milk secretion, while oxytocin induces the milk letdown reflex. And you can just look at mammary tissue under a microscope and tell when it's active. This is highly active tissue. And this is inactive tissue that's been filled in by mostly adipose tissue. And of course, as the female gets older, big changes take place in the breast. It's good to have a baseline mammogram earlier in life, just to be able to follow the changes as they happen. So prolactin surges during nursing, okay? Of course, at birth, estrogen and progesterone levels drop to zip, and so what induces continued prolactin surges are breastfeeding. So tactile stimulation of the nipple causes a big prolactin spike, which produces the milk for the next breastfeeding. And then that breastfeeding induces the prolactin for the next breastfeeding. And on it goes until somebody gets tired. Okay. Since nursing induces prolactin release, it discourages ovulation. And so there are those who have been foolish enough to try and use this as a form of contraceptive, but I think it's not highly dependable. Okay, so as the milk is produced in the mammary glands, the single little units are called alveoli, and then it passes down through the ducts into these ampullae, which this calls lactiferous sinuses. That's the same as an ampulla. And then finally the lactiferous duct passes from the ampulla out the nipple. So for every lobe, remember the breast has 15 to 20 lobes. For every lobe there is a lactiferous sinus, and for every lactiferous sinus there is a lactiferous duct. There's a 1-to-1 correlation. So in the early stages of lactation, we don't have what we would call milk in the strictest sense. It's a secretion that's called colostrum. A good thing about it, doesn't look like milk really at all, but it's highly rich in protein and particularly IgA antibodies. And this is definitely a source of nominal immunity for the newborn, because the newborn has a very naive immune system. So anything you can do to bolster the immune system is pretty helpful. So here you see a nice little graphic that shows colostrum, and look at the antibody titer. If you look at normal human milk and cow's milk and compare that with the antibody levels of colostrum, it's just spectacular amount that you get in colostrum. And there's nothing other really dramatic, more protein in colostrum than in normal milk, although cow's milk has even more. Another thing that pops out at me is the huge amount of calcium you get in cow's milk versus human milk. But there are definitely some very good things about breastfeeding. And a lot of people do it, and some people don't. Okay, so we'll close it up with a little rehearsal, a little review of this chromosomal inheritance one more time. Okay, and back here we're looking at the color blindness thing and this X linkage and color blindness, and we saw that the so-called sex-linked traits were really just X-linked traits. Okay. And so we see that if you have a mother who's a carrier of color blindness and a normal father, there's a 25% chance that you'll have a colorblind son. Of the sons, 50% of them will be colorblind. A non-disjunction, this is the cause of trisomy, or the inheriting an improper number of chromosomes. Okay? And so it's when both chromosomes go one way and nothing goes the other way. And so one daughter cell has none of that, whatever that chromosome was, while the other one gets double. So you can wind up, this person has Turner syndrome.